Have you ever imagined what it was like to travel in the year 1200? Forget GPS, forget comfortable trains or cars, forget even paved roads. Now picture yourself as a woman, journeying across this wild, untamed world. What truly shocking dangers lurked around every corner, just waiting to shatter your perilous journey. Number 15. The threat of banditry on the open road. Imagine stepping out of the relative safety of a walled town and onto a dirt track that winds through dense forests or across barren plains. This was not a pleasant stroll in a park. This was an invitation to a world where law and order were often distant whispers, where the strong preyed on the weak, and where the most common inhabitants of the wild were not cute woodland creatures, but hardened outlaws. For a woman traveling in 1200, the specter of banditry was not just a theoretical concern. It was a very real, very present danger that could materialize from behind any stand of trees or rise over any hill crest. These were not always professional criminals in the sense we understand them today. Sometimes they were desperate peasants driven to crime by famine or injustice. Other times they were disgruntled former soldiers, dispossessed nobles, or even just plain thugs who saw an easy mark in passing travelers. Their motives varied, but their methods were brutally simple: ambush, overpower, and take. For a woman, this meant the loss of her precious few belongings, perhaps her horse if she was lucky enough to have one, and certainly any money or valuables she carried. But the threat went far beyond mere theft. A woman was often seen as a prize herself, a valuable commodity. She could be held for ransom, pressed into involuntary servitude, or face an even darker fate. Fear of these encounters was pervasive, and it shaped travel patterns. People attempted to journey in larger groups, forming temporary convoys, or they sought the protection of armed escorts, which were expensive and not always trustworthy. Even the most powerful lords struggled to keep their vast territories free of these highwaymen, and the wilder, less settled regions were essentially no man's lands, where brigands reigned supreme. Traveling merchants, pilgrims, and noblewomen alike all faced this constant, gnawing fear, knowing that any turn in the road could bring them face to face with the grim reality of life beyond the city walls. Number 14. The scourge of disease and infection. Think about a journey in 1200. There were no clean water sources readily available, no concept of germ theory, and certainly no antibiotics or modern sanitation. Every sip of water from a roadside well, every meal shared at a communal inn, every interaction with a stranger carried an invisible, deadly risk: disease. For a woman, perhaps traveling with children or elderly relatives, this threat was amplified. The medieval period was a time when even a common cold could turn fatal, and a simple cut or scrape could lead to a life-threatening infection. Dysentery, often caused by contaminated food and water, was rampant, leading to rapid dehydration and death. Smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through populations with terrifying speed, leaving devastation in their wake. A woman on the road had no access to medical care as we know it. There were no doctors in every town, and the healers who did exist often relied on superstition and rudimentary knowledge. If a woman fell ill during her journey, she was essentially on her own. There was no comfortable bed in a sterile hospital, no medicines to ease her symptoms or fight off the infection. She might be forced to recover by the side of a road, in a cramped, unhygienic inn, or abandoned by her traveling companions who feared contagion or simply could not afford to delay. Childbirth on the road, as we will discuss later, also dramatically increased the risk of infection for both mother and child. Open wounds, insect bites, exposure to animal waste, and generally poor personal hygiene all contributed to an environment where pathogens thrive. Even something as simple as a toothache could become a dangerous infection, spreading to the jaw and brain, with no effective treatment. Constant threat of illness meant that every journey was a gamble, a roll of the dice against unseen enemies that could strike at any moment, leaving a woman vulnerable, isolated, and fighting for her very life against forces she could neither see nor understand. Number 13. Perils of childbirth on the road. For many women in 1200, travel was not a luxury but a necessity, whether for pilgrimage, marriage, trade, or seeking refuge. And for many women, pregnancy was a regular part of life. Combine these two realities, and you get one of the most terrifying dangers of all: giving birth while far from the comforts and relative safety of home. Childbirth in the medieval era was already incredibly dangerous. Mortality rates for both mothers and infants were astonishingly high, even under the best conditions. Most births occurred at home, attended by experienced midwives, surrounded by family and the necessary supplies. Imagine then a woman going into labor in a dilapidated, unhygienic inn, or worse, by the side of a muddy road, perhaps during a storm. There would be no trained midwife, no clean water, no privacy, and very little in the way of comfort or assistance. The lack of proper tools, clean linens, and even a basic understanding of hygiene meant that infection was an almost certainty. Puerperal fever, a devastating infection that strikes mothers after childbirth, was a common killer. Complications arose, such as a difficult presentation of the baby or excessive bleeding. There was simply nothing that could be done. The woman was utterly at the mercy of fate. Traveling companions, often men, would be ill-equipped to assist, and even other women might lack the necessary experience or courage in such a dire situation. The newborn, too, faced incredible odds. Without proper warmth, clean swaddling, and immediate care, an infant born in such circumstances was extremely vulnerable to cold, disease, and exposure. Even if both mother and child survived the immediate ordeal, the challenges continued. How would a recovering mother and a fragile infant continue their journey? How would they find nourishment? How would they shelter from the elements? For women, especially those of childbearing age, every journey carried the unspoken weight of this potential catastrophe, knowing that life or death could arrive unexpectedly on the road, far from any help or sanctuary. Number 12. Wild animals and untamed wilderness. Beyond the bandits and the diseases, the very landscape itself posed a direct and often lethal threat to traveling women in 1200. Much of Europe was still covered in vast, ancient forests, dark and mysterious, teeming with creatures that were far from domesticated. These were not just deer and rabbits. These were wolves, bears, and wild boars, animals that could be incredibly dangerous, especially if startled, hungry, or protecting their young. For a woman, often without a weapon or the physical strength to defend herself against a large predator, an encounter with one of these beasts could be catastrophic. Imagine the journey through a deep forest at dusk, the shadows lengthening, the sounds of the wilderness growing louder. Suddenly, the gleam of eyes in the darkness, the rustle of a large body, the chilling howl of a wolf pack. These animals were not mythical beasts. They were a very real part of the medieval ecosystem, and they posed a constant threat to travelers. Wolves in particular were notorious for preying on livestock and sometimes on humans, especially the weak or isolated. Bears, while generally preferring to avoid humans, could be ferociously territorial or aggressive if cornered. Wild boars with their sharp tusks were also incredibly dangerous, capable of inflicting severe wounds. Beyond direct attacks, there was the danger of being lost in the wilderness. Roads were often little more than tracks, easily obscured by weather or overgrown by vegetation. Without clear signposts or maps as we know them, a wrong turn could lead a traveler deep into the wilds, away from any human habitation. Lost and disoriented, exposed to the elements, a woman might succumb to hypothermia, starvation, or simply wander into the territory of dangerous animals. Even a minor injury, like a twisted ankle, could be a death sentence in such a remote environment, leaving a woman unable to move, vulnerable to both predators and the unforgiving forces of nature. The wilderness was not just a backdrop for a journey. It was an active, unpredictable participant, holding within its depths numerous ways for a lone woman to meet a tragic end. Number 11. Exposure to harsh weather extremes. Consider the unpredictable and unforgiving nature of weather in 1200 without the benefit of modern forecasts or insulated clothing. For a woman traveling long distances, often on foot or horseback, the elements themselves were a constant, pervasive threat. A sudden downpour could turn a dusty track into a treacherous mud pit, making progress almost impossible and soaking clothing through, leading to hypothermia. Think about journeying through a blizzard in winter, where temperatures plummeted far below freezing. Frostbite was a very real danger, leading to loss of fingers, toes, or worse. Shelter might be hours away, and even then, an unheated, drafty inn offered little true warmth against the biting cold. The snow could obscure the road, causing travelers to lose their way and become stranded, vulnerable to the cold and hungry predators. Conversely, the summer months brought their own dangers. Scorching sun could lead to dehydration and heat stroke, especially for women burdened with heavy clothing and perhaps carrying children. Water sources were often scarce and not always safe. Dust storms could reduce visibility to zero, making breathing difficult and irritating eyes and lungs. Flash floods, particularly after heavy rains, could swell rivers to dangerous levels, making crossings impossible or perilous. Bridges were rare and fords often treacherous. A river crossing could mean being swept away, leading to drowning, especially for a woman encumbered by her clothing or possessions. There was no lightweight, waterproof gear, no instant warmth from a heater. Women often wore layers of heavy wool or linen, which once wet became incredibly heavy and slow to dry, drawing away body heat. Constant battle against the elements meant that a woman had to be prepared for anything, but often the sheer force of nature proved too powerful to overcome. Many journeys ended not due to human malevolence or disease, but simply because the weather turned hostile, proving that even the natural world could be a deadly adversary for the medieval traveler. Number 10. Lack of safe and private accommodation. Imagine traveling for days, weary and desperate for rest. You finally arrive at an inn, a beacon of hope in the darkness. For a woman in 1200, these establishments were often far from the safe havens we might envision. Public inns were typically rowdy, chaotic places, filled with a diverse mix of travelers, merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, and a smattering of less reputable characters. Privacy was a luxury almost unknown. Rooms were often communal, with travelers sleeping on straw mats or shared beds, packed in close quarters with strangers of both sexes. For a woman, this presented a multitude of vulnerabilities. The lack of private sleeping arrangements meant constant exposure to unwanted attention, potential theft, and the terrifying risk of sexual assault. Doors rarely locked, and windows were often unglazed, offering little protection. A woman traveling alone, or even with a small party, would be acutely aware of her vulnerability in such an environment. The innkeeper, if present and honest, might offer some semblance of protection, but their primary concern was profit, not the safety of individual guests. Furthermore, many inns were little more than fronts for illicit activities, attracting gamblers, thieves, and prostitutes. A woman staying in such a place might inadvertently find herself associated with undesirable company, damaging her reputation or putting her in direct danger. Food and drink, while available, were often of questionable quality, increasing the risk of illness. Cleanliness was not a priority, contributing to the spread of disease. Even basic sanitation was rudimentary at best. For a woman needing to maintain her modesty and safety, the conditions were appalling. She might have to relieve herself in a communal latrine or simply outdoors, further compromising her privacy and dignity. Choice was often between sleeping, exposed to the elements, or braving the unpredictable dangers of a crowded, unhygienic, and potentially dangerous inn. There was no true refuge, no guaranteed sanctuary, just a temporary pause in the relentless perils of the journey, where new threats often replaced those left behind on the open road. Number 9. The danger of legal vulnerability and lack of rights. Consider a woman traveling in 1200 and suddenly finding herself embroiled in a legal dispute, accused of a crime, or simply wronged by another. The concept of rights, as we understand them today, simply did not exist, and for women, their legal standing was often severely limited, placing them in an incredibly precarious position far from home. A woman's legal identity was frequently tied to a male relative, her father, husband, or brother. If she was traveling alone, widowed, or unmarried, she might find herself without anyone to advocate for her in a system heavily biased towards men. If she was robbed, assaulted, or defrauded, seeking justice was an almost impossible task. The local lord or magistrate might not be interested in her case, especially if she was a stranger. Testimony might be dismissed as unreliable, or she might not even be permitted to speak on her own behalf. There was no centralized police force to report crimes to, no clear system of appeal, and justice was often dispensed arbitrarily by local power. Imagine being accused of a minor transgression, like inadvertently trespassing, or even a more serious one, such as theft, perhaps due to desperate hunger. Without the ability to prove her innocence, to call upon witnesses, or to pay for legal representation, which was rare and expensive, a woman could find herself imprisoned, fined, or subjected to harsh punishments, all far from anyone who knew her or could offer support. Her word carried less weight than a man's, and she might be easily exploited or scapegoated. If she was a runaway servant or a woman accused of sorcery, a terrifyingly real accusation, even in 1200, her vulnerability was extreme. The absence of universal laws and consistent enforcement meant that a woman's fate could depend entirely on the whim of a local authority figure, and without a powerful male protector, she was often at their mercy. Her legal identity was often subsumed into that of her husband or father, meaning that if she traveled without them, she became an anomaly, an outsider without a recognized place in the rigid social and legal structures of the time. This fundamental lack of legal agency made every journey a step into a potential legal minefield, where a woman could be stripped of her freedom or her very life with little recourse. Number 8. Loss of protector or traveling companion. For most women traveling in 1200, undertaking a long journey alone was exceptionally rare and highly dangerous. Women, especially those of means, typically traveled with a retinue, often including male family members, servants, or hired guards. These companions were not just for company, they were essential for protection, assistance, and maintaining a woman's social standing. Imagine the terrifying scenario. A woman is traveling with her husband, a brother, or a group of trusted servants, and suddenly, disaster strikes. Perhaps the male protector falls ill and dies, or is injured in an accident, or is killed in an ambush by bandits. What happens to the woman then? She is immediately thrust into an unimaginable state of vulnerability. She loses her primary source of physical protection against bandits, wild animals, and other dangers. She loses her voice in a world where women's words often carried little weight without a male advocate. She loses access to funds, as money and property were often controlled by men. She might not know how to navigate the roads, procure food, or manage the practicalities of travel. Even if other members of the retinue remain, their loyalty or capability might be questionable without the central authority figure. A woman left stranded and unprotected on the road became an instant target for exploitation. She could be easily robbed, abducted, or forced into desperate circumstances simply to survive. Her social standing would plummet, and her reputation would be at risk. Without a male protector, she might be seen as an easy mark, an unattached woman whose vulnerability invited all manner of predators. Furthermore, the emotional toll of such a loss, combined with the sudden responsibility for her own survival in a hostile environment, would be immense. The strength and support provided by a male companion or a group of loyal servants were not just comforts, they were critical safeguards against the myriad dangers of the road. To lose them meant to lose her shield, her guide, and often, her very hope of completing her journey safely. Number 7. The risk of starvation and malnutrition. Consider the simple, yet profound, act of eating when you are on a long journey in 1200. This wasn't about finding a fast food restaurant or a convenience store. It was a constant struggle for sustenance, and for a woman, especially one traveling with children or in vulnerable circumstances, it posed a severe threat to her survival. Food sources were scarce and unreliable outside of settled areas. Travelers often relied on what they could carry, and supplies quickly dwindled. Imagine walking for days without seeing a village, and then discovering that the small inn you hoped for has no food or only spoiled provisions. Water was also a significant concern, often contaminated or simply unavailable for long stretches. The concept of food safety was non-existent. Meat could be unrefrigerated for days, bread might be stale and moldy, and vegetables were only seasonal. Consuming spoiled food could lead to severe illness, like dysentery or food poisoning, which, as we discussed, could be fatal in the absence of medical care. For a woman already perhaps more susceptible to certain illnesses, and possibly needing more calories if pregnant or nursing, the lack of reliable, nutritious food was a constant source of anxiety. Even if food was available, it might be expensive, and a woman without sufficient funds could quickly find herself destitute and starving. Pilgrims, for example, often relied on charity, which was not always forthcoming. A woman who ran out of money or was robbed could find herself in a truly desperate situation, facing starvation or forced to beg for scraps. Children, being more vulnerable to malnutrition and dehydration, would suffer even more quickly. The sheer physical exertion of travel, coupled with an inadequate diet, would weaken a woman, making her more susceptible to disease, less able to defend herself, and less resilient to the elements. Hunger was not just discomfort. It was a slow, agonizing danger that could sap a woman's strength, compromise her immune system, and ultimately claim her life far from home. Number 6. Exploitation by guides and fellow travelers. Imagine trusting your life and your meager possessions to someone you barely know, simply because they offer to guide you or share the road. For a woman traveling in 1200, this trust was a gamble, and the stakes were terrifyingly high. While some guides and fellow travelers were honorable, many were opportunistic, and some were downright dangerous. A woman, often seen as inherently weaker and less worldly, was a prime target for exploitation. A hired guide paid to lead her through unfamiliar territory might abandon her in the wilderness, having stolen her money or valuables. He might lead her into an ambush orchestrated by his own confederates. There were no background checks or licensing systems for guides. Their reputation was all that mattered, and that could be easily fabricated or manipulated. Similarly, traveling with strangers for safety in numbers was a common strategy, but it came with its own set of risks. A woman might join a group of seemingly respectable merchants or pilgrims, only to discover their true nature once they were far from any authority. Her new companions might attempt to rob her, take advantage of her, or even sell her into servitude if the opportunity arose. The medieval world was full of desperate people, and a vulnerable woman represented a potential source of income or a means to an end. It was difficult for a woman to discern trustworthy individuals from deceivers, especially when she was exhausted, anxious, and desperate for company or protection. She might feel pressured to accept offers of help that came with strings attached, or to tolerate inappropriate behavior for fear of being left utterly alone. The very people who seemed to offer safety could turn into the gravest threats, leaving a woman betrayed, abandoned, and facing the multitude of other dangers of the road with no one to rely on. The journey itself became a test of discernment, where a wrong judgment could lead to catastrophic consequences. Number 5. The stigma of traveling alone and reputation damage. For a woman in 1200, a good reputation was as valuable as any possession, a shield against societal judgment and often a guarantor of her future. Travel alone, especially for an unmarried or unchaperoned woman, was to risk shattering that reputation irrevocably, regardless of her actual purpose. Society was rigidly structured, and a woman's place was typically within the confines of her home, under the protection of a male relative. A woman seen wandering the roads without a clear, legitimate, and respectable reason, such as pilgrimage, a summons to court, or being part of a noble household's movement, was immediately viewed with suspicion. She might be assumed to be a runaway, a woman of ill repute, or even a witch. These labels carried devastating consequences. If a woman was believed to be a prostitute, she faced immediate ostracization, judgment, and increased vulnerability to exploitation and abuse. No respectable inn would take her in, no respectable person would offer her help, and she might be targeted by unscrupulous individuals. If she was suspected of being a runaway serf, she could be apprehended and forcibly returned to her lord, facing punishment. The accusation of witchcraft, while not as prevalent in 1200 as later, was a real and terrifying possibility. A woman behaving unusually or appearing out of place might be seen as dabbling in dark arts, leading to community suspicion, persecution, and even trial. Even if her intentions were pure, the very act of traveling alone marked her as an anomaly, a woman outside the protective social norms, making her an easy target for gossip, slander, and the erosion of her social standing. This damage could follow her, making it impossible to find employment, a husband, or a respectable place in society once her journey concluded. The journey was not just a physical one, but also a social one, and for a woman, every step taken alone chipped away at the fragile edifice of her reputation, leaving her exposed to not just physical harm, but also the devastating judgment of a society that valued conformity above all else. Number 4. Accidents and physical injury on rough terrain. Imagine the roads of 1200. Forget smooth asphalt or even well-maintained gravel. These were often little more than tracks, carved by centuries of foot traffic, hooves, and cartwheels, turning into muddy quagmires in the rain, dusty ruts in the dry season, or treacherous icy paths in winter. For a woman, especially one on foot or riding a horse, the risk of accidents and debilitating physical injury was ever present and severe. A simple slip on a rocky path could result in a sprained ankle, a broken leg, or a twisted knee. Such injuries were not minor inconveniences in an age without modern medicine. Broken bone could become infected, leading to gangrene and amputation, or simply fail to heal properly, leaving a woman crippled for life. Imagine falling off a horse on uneven ground, suffering a concussion or internal injuries, with no immediate medical attention available. Even riding in a cart, which offered some respite from walking, was no guarantee of safety. These vehicles were often rudimentary, with wooden wheels that could break, axles that could snap, or simply overturn on a steep incline or a sharp bend. A woman could be thrown from the cart, sustaining serious injuries. River crossings, often without bridges, involved wading through strong currents or navigating unstable fords, risking falls or being swept away. The simple act of traversing a hilly landscape, climbing over fallen trees, or pushing through thick undergrowth presented countless opportunities for cuts, scrapes, and bruises, each a potential entry point for deadly infection. The lack of proper footwear and protective clothing further exacerbated these risks. A woman's shoes were often flimsy, offering little support or protection from sharp stones or thorns. Any injury, even a seemingly minor one, could quickly escalate into a life-threatening situation. Without access to doctors, painkillers, or even clean bandages, a woman suffering a serious injury on the road was often left to endure excruciating pain, unable to move, and utterly dependent on the kindness of strangers, or worse, abandoned to her fate. The rugged, untamed landscape itself was a relentless adversary, constantly threatening to trip, to fall, to injure, and to leave a woman stranded and vulnerable. Number 3. Kidnapping and forced servitude or enslavement. For a woman traveling in 1200, one of the most chilling and ever-present dangers was the threat of kidnapping, leading to forced servitude or outright enslavement. While the medieval period is not always associated with the slave trade in the same way as later eras, forms of human trafficking, particularly of women, were distressingly common. Unprotected women were seen as valuable commodities. She could be seized by bandits, rogue knights, or unscrupulous traders and sold into a life of forced labor, perhaps in a distant household, a rural farm, or even as a sex slave. Imagine being snatched from the road, bound, and transported against your will, stripped of your identity and freedom, with no hope of rescue or legal recourse. The demand for domestic servants, agricultural laborers, and concubines meant that a market existed for such human prey. Women who were seen as pretty or strong were particularly at risk. The legal systems of the time offered little protection to the dispossessed or unknown, and once a woman was taken far from her home and family, proving her identity or seeking justice became virtually impossible. She would become a non-person, her past erased, her future dictated by her captors. Even noblewomen were not entirely immune. Though less common, kidnapping for ransom or forced marriage was a very real danger, particularly in times of conflict or political instability. Ordinary women, however, the threat was far more pervasive and insidious, often leading to a lifetime of brutal, uncompensated labor or worse. Fear of being taken, of losing her entire identity and her very existence to the will of another, was a terrifying reality for any woman venturing beyond the safety of her familiar community. It was a fate often worse than death, extinguishing all hope and dignity in a single, brutal act. Number 2, the ever-present threat of sexual assault. Perhaps the most deeply terrifying and pervasive danger for any woman traveling in 1200 was the constant, gnawing fear of sexual assault. This was not merely a risk, but a horrific reality for countless women who ventured outside the protection of their homes and communities. In a society where women often had limited rights and little legal standing, and where male dominance was the norm, a woman's body was often seen as property, something to be taken or exploited by men, particularly those in positions of power or those operating outside the bounds of law. Imagine traveling on a lonely road, in a crowded inn, or through a remote forest. Any of these settings could become the scene of a brutal attack. Bandits, unscrupulous fellow travelers, rogue soldiers, or even powerful local lords could perceive an unescorted or vulnerable woman as an easy target. There was little to no effective policing or a judicial system that would consistently or fairly prosecute such crimes, especially if the perpetrator was a man of influence or the victim was an unknown woman. The shame and dishonor associated with sexual assault often fell upon the victim, not the perpetrator. A woman who had been assaulted might find herself ostracized by her family and community, deemed ruined, making it impossible for her to marry, find respectable work, or regain her social standing. This fear of not only the physical violation, but also the devastating social consequences meant that many women, even if they survived an attack, found their lives irrevocably shattered. The knowledge that such a heinous act could occur at any moment, without warning or protection, and with devastating long-term repercussions, was a constant, heavy burden on any woman who dared to travel. It was a terror that transcended social class, location, and purpose, making every journey a silent, harrowing ordeal for women navigating the treacherous and unforgiving landscape of medieval Europe. Number 1. Superstition and accusations of witchcraft. For a woman traveling in 1200, venturing into unfamiliar territory meant not only facing physical dangers, but also navigating a world steeped in intense superstition, where fear and ignorance often fueled terrifying accusations. One of the most insidious and potentially lethal dangers was the baseless charge of witchcraft or sorcery. While the peak of witch hunts came later, the seeds of such paranoia were firmly planted in the medieval mind. If a woman acted unusually, perhaps due to illness, exhaustion, or simply being an outsider, she could instantly become the target of suspicion in a superstitious village. If she possessed any knowledge of herbal remedies, even simple folk medicine, she might be seen as dabbling in forbidden arts. If she encountered someone's misfortune, such as a sick child or blighted crops, her presence might be blamed. Imagine arriving in a small, isolated community, perhaps seeking shelter or supplies. If she was perceived as different, perhaps she spoke with an unfamiliar accent, or dressed unusually, or simply had an independent demeanor, she could quickly become the focus of collective fear and suspicion. Accusations might stem from malice, jealousy, or genuine, albeit misguided, fear. Once accused, a woman's fate was often sealed. There were no impartial investigations, no presumption of innocence. She might be subjected to cruel trials by ordeal, such as being thrown into water to see if she floated, a sign of guilt, or forced to hold a hot iron. Even if she survived, the damage to her reputation and her life was permanent. She could be driven from the village, imprisoned, or even executed, all based on unfounded fears and prejudices. These accusations were particularly terrifying because they required no physical evidence, only the fearful imaginings of a community. For a woman already vulnerable and far from home, the threat of being branded a witch was a chilling and ever-present danger, a reminder that the greatest perils were not always physical, but could reside in the darkest corners of the human mind.